with us.
My name's Gilbert. I'm an alcoholic. And I want to thank you, Todd, for inviting me to this very prestigious meeting. I'm very honored. I'm very honored to share in any meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I remember Todd asked me if I care to share it at this meeting, and I told him, yes, I'd be honored. And he kind of laid down the format about putting on a sports coat or a suit or tie and a shirt. And I said, sure, I have no problems, and he says, and if I want, he says, I can wear shorts underneath and nobody's going to see. And I said, yeah, that's fine. So I thought I'd do things a little bit different today. Instead of shorts, I put on a pair of thongs. So I'm sitting here and I'm being uncomfortable, right? And I'm looking down and I think I got them on backwards. But nevertheless, for some of you that don't know, I can see that some of you don't know what a thong is, but that's okay. So, in the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous, we talk about Rule 62. Don't take yourself too seriously all the time. And in my share, what you just have gone through with my insanity today, compared to what I'm going to share with you, you're going to be able to see the power of Alcoholics Anonymous work in my life and how great it has worked in my life. You know what, from having a sense of humor today to what it used to be like. And what it used to be like was terrible. You know what, I got to Alcoholics Anonymous in 1977. Rather, I got to a recovery house in 1977. I was a young man. I was 30 years old at the time. And when I got there, I can remember a doctor was giving me a physical checkup, and after he'd done his physical checkup, he told me to put my shirt on, and I put my shirt on. And he reached around and grabbed a bottle, and he gave me the bottle, and he says, here. And I said, what's this? He says, I want you to bathe 3 times a day. And I said, why? He says, because you have scabies all over your body. Now, that was the depths and the demoralization of my drinking career. I went into this recovery house and I can remember I had to detox, and back in them days they had detoxes, but they didn't have that many, and so I detoxed cold turkey. And I went into this recovery house and I was detoxing and I was hallucinating, and but I was still, soundness of my mind was still there. And I could remember, I could hear voices and I could hear people all the way down the hall. And I knew I was hallucinating. You know what? And they allowed me to take as many hot showers as I wanted to relax the muscles in my body. And then I would go to meetings, in-house meetings, and people would come from the streets and they would come and share their experience, strength, and hope. And one of the things that, I'm one of those old timers, I still love that podium. There's something about a podium that when you look at everybody down and you're looking at their eyes, there's just some type of magical power, and I can remember I would sit way in back of the room, the last row. I know we tend to call it death row or back of the bus. And, and I was always sitting back of the bus and I would hear somebody share their experience, strength, and hope. And in my mind, I would say, that SOB hadn't done what I've done, hadn't been where I've been. I was always taking everybody's inventory. And little did I know, later on, I come to realize that the reason why I was taking everybody's inventory is because, I had very low self-esteem, you see. So when I took everybody's inventory, what it did is that it elevated me back up where I could feel better then, and little did I know that, I was being very judgmental, because low self-esteem creates low judgmental, and it also creates self-confidence. I had no self-confidence. I had low confidence within myself. And, you know, I would take everybody's inventory and made myself more superior than them, but never realizing that my disease was killing me. You know, I would hear people share about, you know, their ego and their ego and their ego. And, you know, and I'm not trying to be funny, but to give you some basic idea, you know, because ignorance is a lack of knowledge or information. And they would talk about ego, and I would go, ego, you know, and I'm being serious. I used to tell myself, I'm going to get me one of those birds, man, because everybody's got an ego. I'm not trying to be funny. I am serious with you that, you know, I didn't know what they were talking about. When they talked about, you know, when I'm sharing about low self-esteem, I had no idea what it meant. You know what? The basic education by working the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, I had to learn to educate myself. And, you know, in this recovery house, you know, after about 4 months, I wasn't progressing fast enough for them. And they asked me to leave. And it took a couple alcoholics, you know, one of them that worked there, Bob Espinoza, you know, he asked me, well, what am I going to do? And I said, well, I got to go back home. He says, Gilbert, if you go back home, you know what's going to happen. And I said, well, I don't know. And he says, I'll tell you what, let me talk to my roommate and we'll see if we can take you in. And I said, fine. So, you know, he came back later on that day. He says, if you want, you can come in with us. And I said, fine. And I went with them. And, you know, that was going to be the beginning of the process of my recovery. You know, every morning they get up and go to work and they tell me, Gilbert, you have to go look for a job and you can't come home until we come home. Well, it's obvious that they didn't trust me, and that's fine. And, you know, they would come home in the evenings and they would feed me and you know, I would continue to go on that process of looking for a job. And at some point or another, I managed to get a job. But until then, I could remember I became a secretary of a meeting. They made me a secretary, you know, and being a secretary, I had my own meeting and I was in charge. And I could remember I went to another meeting and they made me the coffee person. And back in the day, you had to wash coffee cups and you had to clean ashtrays and you had to clean out the place. And you know, and I was the custodian to those two meetings. And the process of those two meetings, I could remember when I was, I don't know, maybe 2 years, probably about 2 weeks before my 2-year celebration of sobriety, I decided to go back out and drink again. Not because I had an obsession to drink. You see, I lost the obsession to drink in that recovery house when I finally kicked the habit of the obsession and the compulsion to drink. You know what? I have not had that obsession, and it's been almost 44 years, and I still have not had the obsession to drink, even still today. It doesn't mean that I don't think about drinking. I do, and I ask my sponsor, why do I think about drinking? And he says, because I'm an alcoholic and I'm supposed to think about drinking. And I go, oh, I understood that. You know, and I could remember that when I went back out and I drank and I came back a week later and I decided to move to where I'm at today in this part of the town, and I got a new sponsor. Not that my old sponsor was a bad sponsor. He was a good sponsor. But, you know, I got a new sponsor and I knew I had to make a 180-degree turn in my life. You know, and part of the reasons why I looked at is that first step, admitting that I was an alcoholic, I had no problems admitting an alcoholic. I knew that before I came into that recovery house. But the problem I had is that I couldn't admit that my life was unmanageable and that I was powerless. You see what I mean by that? That I had been loitering around the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous with intent to stay sober. And when I mean loitering, that means that I never went to my sponsor and say, you know what, I'm feeling really sensitive today. You know, where I come from, you don't talk that kind of crap. See, I'm a hood rat. I come from the ghetto. And being in the ghetto, it's all about gang activities. Yes, there's shootings and there's stabbings and they're always hurting people. And I grew up as a child until I came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, can you see me coming to my sponsor and say, I'm feeling really sensitive today. I'm hurt. You know what? Where I come from, you don't do those kind of things because they prey on you. They prey on the weak. And you know what? I didn't come in here weak. I thought I came in here very, very strong. And when I come to realize that, you know what, I had to do things differently. And what I did, you know, ethnicity-wise, I had a lot of problems because I'm a Latino. And being Hispanic, I was never around Anglo-Americans or African-Americans. Well, I was around African-Americans. I'll get into that. And, you know, and I didn't trust Anglos, you know, and I made a decision to get an Anglo sponsor. And he was a good old boy from Oklahoma. And he was about 6'4" and about 280 pounds. And he would call me, Gilbert, Gilbert, hey, Gilbert. And I used to tell him, Harold, my name is Gilbert. And he'd say, hey, Gilbert. I surrendered right there. I said, I ain't going to change this old boy. You know, he has his way of talking, and that's him. And, you know, I loved that guy until the day he died. You know, so, you know, I can remember telling Harold, I said, you know, I went back out and I drank and I need another sponsor. Would you sponsor me? He says, no. And I says, why? He says, because I don't sponsor people. And I said, okay. He says, but I'll be your spiritual advisor. And I said, okay, that's fine. I could live with that. And little did I know at the time, let me go fast forward. Chuck C was his mentor. And Chuck C didn't believe in sponsoring people either. He was a spiritual advisor or mentor. Coming back to Harold, Harold said, I will sponsor you, or I would be your spiritual advisor. And I could remember going to meetings and we talk and we share. And, you know, and one day he says, I want you to learn to work some steps. And I said, oh, fine. And he says, I want you to do a 10th and 11th step every night. And in my mind, being exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous, I said, that ain't right. That doesn't sound right to me. So I came up with an idea that I was going to question him. And I said, Harold, why aren't we doing the first step? And he looked down at me and he smiled. He says, Gilbert, I want you to do me a favor. And I said, what's that? He says, I want you to resign yourself from thinking anymore. And I go, whoa, wait a minute. Can you imagine what was going on in my head, what I wanted to tell him? You know, I don't use vulgarity, only in certain situations that I share with certain groups. If it's a younger group, I use it only to the fact that at that particular point in time in my life, that's how I felt, not that I use it today. And so anyways, once I questioned him and he told me to do a 10th and 11th step every night, and I had no idea where he was taking me. And what had happened is that he wanted me to review my whole day, good, bad, or indifference. And he wanted me to use prayer and meditation. And prayer and meditation is very, very important. And what he was doing is he was having me to find a God of my own understanding. And after a period of time, he would have me say on page 99 in the 12 and 12, the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi every night. And because I didn't know what God's will was, but he directed me to the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, and that gave me some inclination what God's will is. And also at the same time, before we even did step one, we had taken the third step prayer in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, free me from the bondage of self that I may better do thy will, to take away my difficulties at victory over them, that I may bear witness to those, and so forth. And you know what? And I used to say those prayers every night because I was a very angry person. You know, early on in my recovery, in that recovery house, they took me to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the oldest in California, and they call it the Hole in the Ground. And these were the old timers back in the day. And to give you an idea how violent I was, I could remember we were saying the Serenity prayer, and I hadn't been sober 30 days. And there happened to be a man of color. And because I was a racist and a bigot, and I hit this guy with all my might because I was a racist and a bigot. Because the schooling that I come from, if you're white, you stay with white. If you're brown, you stay with brown. And if you're black, you stay with black. And you don't cross that line. And, at that particular point in time, that's the insanity that I came in with the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there had been a few other incidents in my journey in recovery early on that I was a very angry and hostile individual. Coming back to the 10th and 11th step every night, I would say these prayers and review my day and take a look at myself, an honest appraisal of myself. And I could see the good, bad, and indifference throughout the day, what I was doing and how I was living my life. And there came a point where my sponsor said, Gilbert, give it. He says, give it. It's time that we work the first step. And I had to learn to get honest even more honest with my sponsor. And I said, Harold, I don't know how to read or write. And now I'm 32 years old. And he looked at me and he says, well, didn't you ever go to school? I said, I never went to grammar school. He said, what did you do? I used to walk the streets and play on the streets, play the LA River. I go down Skid Row and go to the movies, because I would get in for free. I would get a wire, open the back door and go to the movies every day. And I went to high school only one time, to a high school that was kind of, there were kids that were ready to go to the penitentiary. That was the last block on the house for kids like me. And I only went because I wanted to go into public school. They wouldn't allow me in public school because I was incorrigible. And I went to an all-boys school. And at lunchtime, we would smoke dope, pop pills, and somebody would jump the fence and go to the liquor store and buy a short dog, of white port with lemon juice. And we would pop that cap open, put the lemon in there, and we started drinking. Then we go back to class wasted. And they knew we were high. They knew we were drunk. But they didn't care. They just wanted a body count. And we pass out and go to sleep, and teacher would come and wake us up, and we go to the next class. And that's part of the insanity of the lifestyle that I had led. And coming back to where I'm at today, telling Harold that I didn't know how to read and write, he looked at me and he says, well, I have a suggestion for you. And I said, what's that? He says, I want you to go to 5-step study meetings a week. I said, 5-step study meetings a week? I said, why? He says, I want to go to participation meeting. I want to go to speaker meetings. He says, no. He says, I've watched you. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, do you know what your nickname is? And I said, no. Everybody calls you the honeybee. I said, why are they calling me a honeybee? Because you want to pollinate all the flowers in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, meaning the women. And I said, oh, man, honeybee? That was a new one on me. But needless to say, I went to these step study meetings a week. And I found 5-step study meetings. And when the book would come around, they didn't have a lot of books. They only had one book. And the book would be passed around, and it would come to me. And I would say, my name's Gilbert, I'm an alcoholic, and I'll pass. And, after a period of time, in one of those meetings, I said, my name's Gilbert, I'm an alcoholic, and I'll pass. And somebody in the background says, Gilbert, why don't you read? And, I was outraged. In my mind, it was like, you effing so-and-so, who in the hell do you think you are by fronting me off? And because what he did is he fronted me off. And, after I went through my little insanity, I got honest. And that was going to be the beginning of practicing humility in my life. So what had happened is that I told the group I just didn't know how to read. And, they said, well, Gilbert, just try. And, the favorite say of an alcoholic, you don't understand. And that's what I kept saying. And they said, Gilbert, just try. And you know what? It came to me, and there happened to be maybe about 6 lines in a paragraph. And man, if I read maybe 2, 3 words out of that whole paragraph, that I was able to read, that was about the experience that I had about reading and writing. And by the time I was done with that paragraph, I was perspiring. You would have thought that I was detoxing because I was perspiring. My armpits were wet. The back of my shirt was wet. The front of my shirt was wet. You know what? And I was perspiring so much that, you know what? It was the fear and the shame that was oozing out of my pores in my body, because shame had held me back for so many years that I couldn't function as a human being, because shame uh, had dictated my whole way of thinking. If you were reading a paper, I would walk away from you because I just didn't want to be somebody to say, well, look at this, read this, Gilbert. Because shame had dominated my life. The fear and my actions and my behavior, which I call my ABCs, my attitude, my behavior, and my conduct. And I couldn't read. And now I'm starting to read. And that book would come around and I'd be oozing still. I would be perspiring like you would not believe, every time I read. But you know what? I did the action. And the action is what participating in my recovery. And at some point or another, after a long period of time, I had an awakening. Like that 12 step says, having had a spiritual awakening. And it's not the spirituality, it was the awakening that the power of Alcoholics Anonymous has been working in my life, and what had happened is that I started reading and reading, and it caught my attention that nobody was saying anything. And I finally come to the realization that the power of Alcoholics Anonymous, that I have been able to read in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, through the power of the people, the unity that the first tradition talks about, the unity and the love and the action of another alcoholic helping another alcoholic is so powerful that it moved me, to a point where I said, wow, this thing really, really works. And at some point or another, man, I begin to work steps with Harold. And you know what, I begin to work a 4-step, and that 4-step is what I'm sharing with you. A lot of my behavior, a lot of things that I was afraid to share with Harold. You know what, at some point, it came to the 8th and 9th, no, 6th and 7th step, where I've been able to take a look at my character defects and my shortcomings. Because fear all of my life dominated my life. And I could remember, to give you an idea, my anger issues, that I have shared with Harold. There's a lot of things I don't want to talk about, and some things I will talk about. I could remember sitting in a cell, in my early 20s, and I was there because I had attempted to commit murder on a federal officer. Something went wrong, and I did stupid things, and I can remember sitting in the cell in high power. High power is for the most dangerous people. And I can remember laying in my bunk, and all of a sudden this guard calls me, and I walk up to the bars, and I looked at him, and I could see he was a lieutenant because he had bars on his collar. And he looked at me and he says, if this officer doesn't make it, you are not going to make it out of here alive. And man, I went back to my, right there at that attitude, I told him to F off, and I walked back to my bunk, and I had a moment of clarity. The moment of clarity is that I felt the despair in my actions and my behavior. Then I asked myself this question: how did I get here? From 0 to 10, I have never been able to think or process any thoughts in my mind. I've always went from being a nice guy to I'm willing to commit murder. And, in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, I've shared that with my sponsor. And there's other things that I don't want to share with you, that it doesn't really, it involves a lot of gang activity. I surrounded myself with cartel members and so forth in Los Angeles, and and I was amongst them. Not that I was a part of them, because I never wanted to be a part of them. Because today, if you were there, tomorrow you'd be gone. And I knew that, and I seen it. And, and I shared that with Harold. And being an alcoholic that I was, man, I was hooked up with gang members, and we'd go out and pull robberies, about 4 of us. We walk in the store, and it was about a fight at the old Cape Corral. Let's stick 'em up time, and that's my background, and at some point I got caught. I finally got caught, and that's what brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous, part of it. And doing so, I told Harold that I didn't know how to read and write, and I learned how to read and write in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, man. That doing that 10th and 11th step every night, and I'll get to the amends right now. But, doing the 10th and 11th step, what I have learned through the 11th step is that prayer and meditation, prayer is learning discipline. And meditation is to shape my thoughts with spiritual ideas. Because having had a spiritual awakening, what the spirituality is, having a relationship with reality, and the reality is that where I'm at today. I thank God for Harold. Because what I've learned is to adopt a new attitude and action in my daily affairs. Because you see, when I went back out early on in my recovery, it was all about the compulsion and the obsession of the mind. It had nothing to do with wanting to drink. Because of the compulsion and the obsession of my mind, nothing had changed early on in my recovery. And thank God that, we say around here, sanity is the soundness of the mind. And I had to take a look at the compulsion and the obsession. And and having that relationship with God is the most important thing, because where I come from, the unmanageability, I had to learn some responsibilities and accountabilities for my actions and my behavior and my conduct. I used to think that my feelings always got me into trouble. My feelings never got me into trouble. It was my actions and reactions that always got me into trouble. That's why I always wound up in jail. My actions or reactions. As a result of learning to get honest around here, I had to learn to cut away denial and replace it with honesty. Because the denial was killing me. You see, my disease tries to separate me from God every day. And I have to be aware of that. That's why my relationship with God is very strong today, because my disease will try to separate me. That's why every day is learning to adopt a new attitude and action. While I continue to stay in prayer. Prayer is a lifeline to God. My spirit, I have to learn to honor and respect my spirit and to be obedient to God. Because if I'm not, then I'll be back out on Skid Row again with scabies all over my body. That's not what I want today. For the love of God and Alcoholics Anonymous, I've been able to stay here. Come in 8 days, come next week, I'll have 42 years of sobriety under my belt. And I don't say that because I want your applause. I say that because I don't know if we have any newcomers. But if we do have any newcomers, all I want to say to you is that if you don't want to drink, you don't have to. You just have to want to stay more sober than wanting to drink. And coming back to that unmanageability and responsibilities, what happened is that, I learned to find some happiness. And happiness is a choice, and so is suffering. And I had to ask myself, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? And most of the time, I want to be happy. Practicing humility is learning to surrender to God. That compulsion and that obsession today, my mind still goes there today. I'll give you a basic idea. Early on in recovery, I went to the racetrack, not even a year. sober. And I spent $5 on a horse and I lost. It's been over 40 years and I'm still trying to get that $5 back. Now, is that a compulsion, an obsession? Well, the difference is today is that I don't leave my paycheck. I go and I enjoy myself. And thank God for the power of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know what? God has changed my feelings of myself. And if you notice, I said, God has changed my feelings of myself. Because today I have a desire to face my fears. You see, when my spirituality grows, my ego dies. And that's the power of Alcoholics Anonymous. See, recovery is not painful. It's the resistance that hurts. And I quit hurting because of the power of Alcoholics Anonymous. Just one more time. You know, I got here with very distorted thinking. On one hand, I had an acute bipolar attitude. On the other hand, I had an acute narcissist. And if you know anything about a narcissist is always right and has all the answers. And the bipolar attitude, the acute bipolar attitude I had was the violence that I came in with in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when you combine both of those insanities, you have very distorted thinking. And my perception was off, all twisted. And all these words that I'm throwing at you, I had no idea what they meant. Because ignorance is a lack of knowledge or information. And I had to educate myself because Harold says you got to get a dictionary. And over here, I have a library that I have about 3 different dictionaries. And I have a library of books of Alcoholics Anonymous, the original manuscript of Alcoholics Anonymous when it was first made. You know what, my library is somewhat big, you know. But with that, you know, I thank God. You know, the amends aspect that I want to come to now is that I could remember I went to, we discussed about making amends, me and Harold, and Harold sat me down. And it's all about good timing and good judgment about learning to make amends. And when I made my amends, the first amends I made to was my mother. And I can remember coming to her house, and Harold already schooled me. He told me this is not a debating issue. This is an issue that you learn to listen and listen to learn. And I said, okay. So I sat down and I proceeded to tell my mother that, you know, I'm here to make my apologies and my amends. And this little old woman stood up and she pointed her finger at me, and then she pointed her finger out. She had this big bay window. And she pointed her finger and she says, you know, I don't want to hear a thing that you have to tell me. He says that if you go back with those people, wherever you just came from, and stayed with those people, you will have cleaned the slate with me. And I was kind of disappointed. You know, I went to Harold the following day, and I told him, I proceeded to tell him what happened. And he smiled and he looked at me. He says, do you see what happened, Gilbert? And I said, no. He says, it's the attraction rather than the promotion. See, she had been seeing me already for a couple of years sober, and she realized that, you know what, I was on a straight and narrow path with Alcoholics Anonymous. She didn't want to hear a thing I had to say. She was already convinced through the power of Alcoholics Anonymous and the power of the people in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I can remember making my amends with my children, and there were children at the time. You know, my oldest son is 57 today, you know, and he lives with me because he just sold his house and he's in the process of looking for another home, and he asked if he could stay with me. I said, sure, him and my grandson. So I could remember I made amends to my kids when they were young. Everything's about good timing and good judgment. And the timing was terrible, and my judgment was terrible because they were too young. And, you know, my kids didn't want anything to do with me. It had been 20 years since I've seen my kids. And I used to tell my sponsor, those effing, you know what, son of a, you know what, they don't call me for my birthday. They don't call me for Christmas. Those little, you know what, don't they know that I'm their father? Don't they know I gave them life? And Harold would very kindly tell me, Gilbert, look what you've done to them. And you know, about 20 years ago, my son called me up and he asked to talk to me, and I said, fine. And it's all about good timing and good judgment. And God seemed fit that it took 20 years for me to understand with patience and tolerance and learning to listen and listen to learn. And he sat down and we started talking, and he proceeded to tell me his pain. And I had to shut my mouth and I had to listen. And I listened to his pain. And all I could say is, I'm sorry, son. And I don't want to go through life saying I'm sorry all the time to you. And he said, fine. My daughter, she called me up some months later and same thing. As a result of the power of Alcoholics Anonymous is that I have my kids in my life. It took over 20 years for them to succumb to their pain, that they can confront me and have a relationship with me. You know, my son was in the military for 21 years and he got wounded various times in various campaigns and I've been able to help him, you know, and one of his events when he came to live with me, when he came out of the service, is that I asked him, why don't you go to college and become a nurse? And he did. And he became a nurse and I helped him through it. And then I told him, why don't you go work for the VA? You put 20 some years in the military. Why don't you double dip on your retirement? And he did. And the end result is my son plays doctor with me, checks my heart, my ears, looks up my nose, and that's just about it. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to go with that. But nevertheless, nevertheless, he looks out for me. You know what? He would call me up, says, Dad, how you doing today? Do you need anything? Dad, I'm going to come over and I'm going to check your heart and so forth. And he says, Dad, you'll call me up. Now he calls me up, says, Dad, do you need anything in the store? And then when he hangs up, he says, Dad, I love you. Man, what else can I ask for? But it took 20 years. It took 20 years of learning to listen and learning to listen, to succeed, you know, in my recovery, to have a connection and a strong connection with God, because I'm in prayer every day. You know what? I'm not exempt from insanity. Trust me. You know what? I can get in my car right now and I can drive down the street and there's a little old lady doing 20 miles an hour. And in my heart of hearts, in my mind of mind, I could be saying, you dumb old, you know what, so-and-so, and I'm going crazy. And then God whispers in my ear and he tells me, Gilbert, why don't you just go around her? And I go, oh, okay. So now I'm going around her and I'm going to get spiritual. And I wave at her and say, have a nice day, Mama. You know, is that distorted thinking? Yes. Am I exempt from distorted thinking? No. The insanity never sleeps. My disease is a God in itself. It's the God of darkness. And I'd rather live with my God in the light, because the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi tells me, where do I want to be? You know, and I try to learn to understand today. You know what, and the process of my recovery has been great. You know what, I'm running out now, and I just want to thank you people for allowing me to come into your homes today. I want to thank you for being patient and tolerant to listen to my experience, strength, and hope, that hopefully that I may be able to benefit maybe one person. You know what, and that's all I ever wanted in recovery, you know, just one person. You know, right now I'm in the process of wanting to go to Guatemala because I do a lot of H&I into the prisons in Latin America and Mexico and Colombia and I go into the penitentiaries there and I take literature for the convicts and I haven't said nothing to Carmen yet. But anyways, so I'm in the process of pondering those thoughts and see where it's going to go. But nevertheless, I want to thank you again. Thank you so much for being patient here. Thank you for loving me when I have been able to love myself. Thank you.